Um, okay, welcome everybody. My name is Andres Gannon, and me, along with Chelsea Estencona, are the co-organizers of the online Peace Science Colloquium. This program was started in 2015 as part of the annual meeting of the Peace Science Society to celebrate the excellent research that happens before and after the annual Peace Science Society meeting, to share it with a wider community online. The website for the Peace Science Society is peacescience.unt.edu. And we can also be found on Twitter at PSS_OPSC. Today we have a paper titled Alignment Decisions in the Face of Interstate and Extrastate Aggression, Evidence from UN Voting by Artem Kvartalnov. And we have three excellent discussants who are going to give some feedback on this paper: Andrew Coe and Brad Smith, who are both at Vanderbilt University, and Anton Strezhnev of the University of Chicago. The basics for the way that participation will go is that Artem will present for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have the three discussants give their feedback and start a discussion. Attendees are invited to leave comments or questions in the chat, and given how we're doing on time and the flow of the discussion, I will help incorporate the comments from the chat into the discussion. We'll prioritize comments from the discussants, but all information that's listed in the chat is going to be saved and sent to the presenter so that we can maximize feedback. So the structure for today is Artem will present the paper for about 15 minutes, then we'll open it up to discussion, starting with the discussants, and then we'll conclude close to the top of the hour. So Artem, we'll turn it over to you now to go ahead and present.
All right, thank you. Let me just start sharing. Yeah, so here it is. Good morning, everyone. My name is Artem Kvartalnov. I am a third-year PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm really grateful to the Peace Science Society for the opportunity today, to the discussants, and to everyone else who joins. The title of my paper is Alignment Decisions in the Face of Interstate and Extrastate Aggression. This is going to be the first chapter of my dissertation and hopefully journal submission in the near future. So any feedback is greatly appreciated. So let's get started. The big question of what third parties do when they observe an act of aggression in international relations has been a focus of international security researchers for many decades. Well, it is hard to say that there is any specific consensus on what they do or on the determinants of third-party alignment decisions, but the very general understanding is that we know from war expansion literature that states probably remain neutral most of the time. They oppose threatening aggressors, where threats can be defined very differently depending on the theoretical tradition in question. They sometimes bandwagon for profit when they anticipate that the aggressor in the current act of aggression is likely to extract some benefits out of the current war in the future. We also have a lot of empirical works that first discuss what makes states more likely to join an ongoing conflict, and given joining, conditional joining, what encourages them to support the attacker or the target. Although there is a lot of work on that, we have some issues with data availability that are very pronounced to the extent that pretty much everything that is listed here uses data on militarized interstate disputes. And I also think that some theoretical considerations pertinent when it comes to alignment decisions in the face of aggression are not properly accounted for. And this is something that I'm going to focus on for the next couple of minutes. So based on such theoretical treatments of the topic as Powell 1999 and our very general understanding of what alignment decisions are, I think that there can be four factors here. So the first one is costs and benefits of alignment. As this tiny picture tells you, alignments can happen in very different circumstances. So you can be voting on a UN resolution, you can be sending military equipment, you can be initiating a military intervention. These are very different, and the cost of doing all these things are different. So it takes you a lot of effort to do something that is more costly. So it is hard to compare these different situations when you do not have variables for that. And even if you focus on the same type of reactions like militarized interstate disputes, joining militarized interstate disputes, it can still be hard to compare, say, joining the Second World War and joining a regional conflict, say, in the 1990s, right? So my own understanding is that this part of the puzzle has not been addressed properly. So attacker's gain is something that can be very uncertain, both for third parties and for researchers, because when the third party makes its own alignment decision, it is often unclear whether the aggressor will extract some benefits in the future. So I think that the level of uncertainty here is pretty even, both for researchers and for third parties. So I think we have been able to address this part in existing literature. Attacker's resolve can be kind of tricky. So we have variables like battle-related death or conflict events, but still, empirical literature is not that good at understanding reputations, the actual signals that states perceive as indicators of belligerence in international relations. So this part is kind of really hard to measure and needs to be accounted for in future literature in one way or another. And the best understood part of this process is the dyadic threat level. So alliances, ideal distances, and other measures of the relationship between two specific states can account for that part of why states makes a specific alignment decision. But the elephant in the room, and well, this question right in the middle of the slide is who is the attacker? So we know that existing data sets like data on militarized interstate disputes, they usually have some measures of like conflict originators, but there is a broad understanding as a discipline that the quality of that data is limited because we don't really know for sure whether those originators are politically responsible for the conflict that we are considering in a specific instance. And then this is a problem because even our language, like bandwagoning with the aggressor, balancing against the aggressor, well, you can't bandwagon with the target, right? You can't balance with the target against the target. And if we don't know who is politically responsible for the conflict, it is very hard to perform any, well, subsequent empirical analysis on alignment decisions because you have to align with the aggressor or against the aggressor. And this is the broad picture that I'm trying to address here. And here is the empirical strategy that I am trying to use here. So with costs and benefits of alignment, I think that we should hold them constant as much as possible because it can be very hard to measure them. Attacker's gain, well, can be measured because it is uncertain for both researchers and the third parties themselves. Attacker's resolve can be partially controlled for, partially measured. Dyadic threat levels can be measured. On top of that, I really want to have a representative sample of third parties here. So the decision to align is not specific to great powers or any other select groups of states. And well, we definitely need more data to be able to perform powerful statistical tests on alignment decisions in the face of aggression. This is just the list of hypotheses that I test here. There is nothing very unusual here, so I don't want to focus on them too much, but these are just general factors that we think can be related to alignments in one way or another. And the more interesting part starts here. So this is the data pipeline that I use for empirical tests presented in this paper. So I rely on this old but continuously updated data set that dates back to the ICPSR project on that. So UNJ roll call votes. They can be on very different topics, right, including conflict and aggression. And what I do is I compile a list of keywords on conflict and aggression, and then manually examine all those resolutions to identify which of them actually condemn or denounce a specific act of aggression. I manually identify aggressors from resolution texts, and this produces a list of 390 resolutions that are used for subsequent data analysis. So to be a little more specific here, these are the keywords. They were used in a search across long descriptions and short descriptions of UNGA resolutions. This produced several thousand resolutions. They were then manually examined, and the aggressor was coded for all resolutions for which that was possible. This is just an example resolution. So here you can see that the Russian Federation is the occupying power, and it is urged to withdraw its military forces. So when I see this kind of resolution, I draw the conclusion, well, yeah, the Russian Federation is the aggressor here. I totally understand that this is still a very subjective measure. Like, we know that this measure is the opinion of nation states, but because this is the opinion of the international community, I kind of assume that it is, well, broad enough to be considered the point of departure here, right? And depending on the third party's opinion on this resolution, vote on this resolution, we can say whether the third party is, well, mildly supporting the aggressor or supporting the target. And this is the data structure that is produced as a result of this data pipeline and used in subsequent analysis. So on the one hand, we do have a whole lot of roll calls here, but on the other hand, every roll call contains votes cast by different third parties, and this allows two different questions. Well, when it comes to the empirical part of it. So one empirical question is, why do different third parties respond differently to the same act of aggression? So, for instance, we can compare geographic distances or political relationships with the same aggressor, and this allows for a pretty clean test of why a specific third party would support a specific aggressor target, right? And the second question empirically here would be, why do third parties respond differently to different acts of aggression? So this would be the vertical arrow here comparing different acts of aggression, or at least different resolutions. And this analysis contains 53,000 observations and the full specification. So again, this is a lot of data for international security, where we usually have to work with very small data sets. This is just a descriptive representation of the data. So it is pretty easy to see here that yes votes, that is condemnation of aggression, are pretty common. So this is quite different from what we know from, say, war expansion literature that says that states remain neutral most of the time. So I think this picture should tell us that general statements about alignment decisions are, well, very hard to make without understanding the cost of those alignment decisions, right? Because here we see that the alignment decision is very cheap. It is, you just support the resolution or oppose it. And in this kind of situation, well, balancing is much more common than we generally believe. So for actual inferential analysis here, I use linear models with demeaned level 1 variables. This is because I have two dimensions here that I just mentioned, right? So we can compare how different third parties respond to the same act of aggression, but we also can compare different acts of aggression over time. And we really want to keep as much available variation as possible here, but still reduce risks associated with omitted variable bias. And these are the coefficient plots that I got with these analysis. So the three highlighted coefficients are those that are robustly statistically significant across 12 different subsamples that are listed here on the right. So lagged ideal distance predicts alignment decisions. Again, when you are further away, ideally, from the aggressor, you are more likely to balance against that aggressor. When you are allied with the aggressor, you are more likely to bandwagon with that aggressor. And the coefficient in voters' liberal democracy here tells you that there is a monadic relationship, suggesting that democracies are somewhat more likely to balance against any aggressor, regardless of whether that aggressor is a democracy or not. So I ran a lot of robustness checks on top of having 12 different subsamples here. So one can see that lagged ideal distance is statistically and, well, substantively significant across all of them, including in the subsample that includes only contiguous states. Alliances lose significance in some tests, specifically with fixed effects, but they're still significant in most of them. And well, when I remove lagged ideal distance from the regression, the significance of lagged ideal distance is then conveyed by the significance of alliances. So these two factors are definitely competing for influence in the regression context. And while vote with liberal democracy is still predictive of balancing in most tests here, but one can see that two-way fixed effects exhibit slightly weaker coefficients for on voters' liberal democracy, which suggests that, well, it is not necessarily true that states become more likely to balance as they democratize, right? And well, these coefficients are insignificant in the pooled regression, but the pooled regression is affected by omitted variable bias that I wanted to reduce by using the analysis that are presented here. And so the general broad conclusions here are as follows. It appears that states balance against enemies and bandwagon with friends. There is also pretty strong evidence suggesting that democracies are more likely to balance against any aggressor. And this is, well, rare evidence in favor of monadic peacefulness or monadic support for the current order by liberal democracies. And these conclusions also lead me to ask additional questions or like to some additional considerations here. So it appears that alignment choices are really different from states' ability or willingness to well balance or bandwagon, right? So we see here that when alignments are really cheap, power is insignificant, right? And an additional question that that I'm asking here, given the result that I have. So I've seen that shared interests are not really predicted. They do not really proxy for material factors in these models. And then the question is, where do those shared interests come from? So do we need, as a discipline, to have a better understanding of why states decide to, well, vote together or to ally with each other? And here is just the list of points that I am particularly interested in feedback on. So I really would like to streamline my theoretical contribution. I understand that I've done a lot on the data part, but what is the best way to present the theoretical part of this paper? So I'm also very open to any comments on adding appropriate variables, running appropriate analysis, and well, if you have any ideas on other literature that I should speak to here, also very open to these comments. And with that, thank you so much, and I really look forward to the conversation here.
Great. Thank you so much, Artem. We'll go ahead and turn it over to our discussants now. So we'll start with Andrew Ko, then Brad Smith, and then Anton Strezhnev.
Okay. Hi, Artem. So let me say first, I really like the idea behind this paper. I think it's very promising. I think it's a very nice theoretical idea to try to separate out the direct measurement of alignment, which after all is just about which side some third party favors in a conflict and not really about how exactly the third party goes about expressing that alignment. And I took your argument as convincing that most of the ways that alignment has been measured involves a fairly high cost expression of your preference for one side or another, and thus is creating all these selection biases that we're not really fully taking account of because plenty of states, just don't have the capability or the willingness to do things like, transfer arms to their favored side or directly intervene in a militarized interstate dispute themselves. So I really like that. I also, I applaud the process you did to first kind of screen out among all the zillions of UNGA resolutions which ones are potentially relevant to your question, and then even better that you then went and hand coded all of these resolutions. I think in recent times, the temptation has been to like dump all these things into ChatGPT and say, you know, all-knowing, all-seeing AI, please tell me what these resolutions are about, who they target, and so on. That might be a viable way to go, but I'm pretty confident that your way of doing it will result in a less error-prone measurement. So I was happy to see you put in that level of effort. I know that must have been a lot of work. Okay, having said those nice things, let me find some things to pick on. So first, um, about the way you explain your theory. So all of your hypotheses about what's going on in these alignment decisions are framed in terms of, okay, there's some independent variable, whether it's the democracy of the aggressor or the democracy of the voter or the trade ties between them or whatever the independent variable is, quote, invites some response, whether it's balancing or bandwagging or remaining neutral. I don't know what that means in the context of a categorical choice to either vote yes or vote no or abstain. Is what you're telling me with these hypotheses that you expect that some independent variable is going to increase the tendency to vote yes relative to all other possible responses? Of course, it'd be very interesting to try to develop more specific hypotheses like, well, I expect yeses to go up relative to nos, but I also expect abstentions to go up relative to both yeses and nos, right? In principle, there's a much larger set of hypotheses that a complete theory would specify that each of these independent variables would affect. And in each case, you're only specifying one. Like I expect the absolute rate of this particular response to go up in response to this variable. So I think there are many more hypotheses you could be testing here to the extent that your theory can be more specific about how the relative rates of the three different responses will change. Relatedly, when it comes to turning this theory into an analysis of the data, you say you use these linear models. That part I was also very unclear on. I'm aware of the methodological work that says that you can't really do that much better than linear models, even if your dependent variable is not continuous, but is just ordinal. But I'm not at all clear that your dependent variable is ordinal. I assume you're treating this as, yes is like the high thing, no is like the low thing, and abstention is somewhere in between. But that's a pretty strong assumption. Um, Abstention could be related to lots of things that aren't really an indication that a state is equivocating between yes and no. They may have a very strong preference, but find that some cost is going to be imposed on them if they vote in line with that preference, and so just choose not to vote. So I'm a little bit worried that the specification of hypotheses is bleeding into the specification of the empirical model in a way that doesn't correspond to the structure of the underlying data. Okay, next comment, very much along those lines. Much of this is written as though whatever it is that generates resolutions and roll call votes in the UN General Assembly in some sense reflects ground truth. That might be true. You could be right about that, but I needed at a minimum more hand-holding about that, and certainly I could be more convinced. So I believe you that individual roll call votes are much less subject to selection than something like imposing sanctions or joining a militarized interstate dispute. But the resolutions themselves, it seems to me, are quite manipulable in a way that whether you impose sanctions or not is not. Who offers a resolution? It's not at random the selection of who decides to ask that something be put up for a vote. What determines whether a resolution that is proposed by someone actually gets put up to UNGA vote? Who determines who gets labeled as the aggressor or not in those resolutions? That's surely highly political. What about resolutions? You mentioned that there are some resolutions that condemn both sides to a conflict as aggressors. There are also resolutions that condemn neither side. So, what's going on there and what determines when some particular instance of conflict is put into the both sides are aggressors or neither side is versus if it's put into the we're willing to pick a side and call that the aggressor. Um, that's surely related to the influence of powerful actors like the United States and its allies. It's surely also related to an impression of what the kind of prior state of opinion in the international community is on like who's at fault for some particular dispute. So I just wanted to, ideally this paper would tell us a lot more about the underlying data generating process that results in there was a resolution for this conflict. It did label one and only one side as the aggressor, and it was put up for a vote. Um, I mean, one thing you could, I think, pretty straightforwardly answer with your data, is it the case that every instance of international conflict ends up getting a resolution of some kind? How often for conflicts that are lasting over multiple years? Are they being voted on in every UN General Assembly, or are there conflicts where when it starts, there's a vote to condemn or not, and then it's sort of left in abeyance? These are all important things to understand for like what's showing up in this data set and what isn't. Okay. Um, Much of the discussion of the results, I mean, I think it's you've done a lot of work in terms of let me think of all the things in the abstract that someone could find an objection to in the way I've defined the sample or the particular measures I've chosen for independent variables, or maybe various issues with, am I clustering standard errors in the right way? Am I accounting for various sources of heterogeneity in the right way? All of that is great. But the kind of net result of your focus on that is that the both the explanation of the theory and the reporting of the results are almost completely bereft of proper nouns. So I just had very little sense of like what is actually going on in this data. Like, can you give us proper noun examples of here are some particular resolutions and particular votes, or particular states that tend to vote in a way that either correspond closely to what your theory would expect or don't correspond to it? Can you give us some examples of, how much of what is going on here is related to conflicts involving Israel? You allude to this in some of the controls you run, but I wanted a little more like how many of these resolutions involve Israel? How many of them, how much of the resolutions involving a democratic aggressor on which many of the other control variables depend are fundamentally just about Israel, as opposed to some kind of general set of democratic aggressors. Um, how much of what's going on here is, one superpower's aligned orbit of states versus the other superpower's aligned orbit of states as they're all voting on various proxy conflicts that took place during the Cold War? You do separate the sample into things that happened during the Cold War and things that didn't, but of course, even within that, there are lots of instances of aggression during the Cold War that are ultimately about proxy conflicts, and there are also lots of instances of aggression that don't seem to be about that. So, more discussion of the proper nouns here, like what is actually going on, who's driving this. Um, the way it's phrased now is very much comes off in the flavor of, well, you have a bunch of, exchangeable states and exchangeable crises on which votes are happening, and there's not really a sense of like, what's the underlying structure of the system here? Like how much of this is just being driven by two competing coalitions during the Cold War and one kind of dominant hegemon and its clients in the post-Cold War period. Okay, and then the last thing I'll offer, and then I'll turn it over to the next discussant, is to say that I appreciate the sophistication of the statistical analysis you do here, but for simple souls like me, I'd really appreciate first just seeing the simplest possible counting of how many things correspond to your theory and how many don't. So if you just look one resolution at a time, within each of those resolutions, say in your variables on the type of aggression or aggressor, how many of the votes correspond to what your theory expects and how many don't. Just a kind of simple, the sort of equivalent of like bivariate tables for this theory would be really helpful for seeing, okay, how much is really changing in the picture once we do all this subsample analysis and control variables and so on. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. So I'm just gonna repeat a lot of the things that Andrew said. Um, so I agree. I think this is interesting, and I think that so a lot of my comments are sort of I have some stuff that's going to echo and expand on some of the points that Andrew made. And I also have some ideas about framing. So I'm going to start with the framing stuff because I think it points towards some other things I think you could do with this data. So I read the paper very much as a paper about sort of in the vein of sort of Anton's previous work, where it's, states have these preferences and we want to figure out what they are, right? Um, I I think I think that one thing you could do with this is to answer a different but related question that I don't really think has been addressed in the literature, which is what determines this may be the way that you're thinking about this, because I think one way to interpret what you've written is in this way, but it's sort of what determines states' willingness to publicly state their preferences, right? To take a stand on something. And I think this is where Andrew's comments about the the fact that the resolutions are themselves written in a specific way, presumably, is really important. Because one thing that's striking to me when I read the paper is the graph that you showed in the presentation as well. There are some big swings and exceptions to this pattern, but for the most part, if you fit a regression to the percentage of yes and no votes, they're both going to be really flat, right? And that to me is consistent with the resolutions themselves being the product of strategic decision making, anticipating we're not going to file a resolution unless we can get about 70%, right? That some model that produces that as the equilibrium prediction, I think, is probably what explains the resolutions in the form we get them. So I think that creates some difficulties along the lines of some of the things Andrew raised, but I think it also presents some opportunities to use the data that you already have to think about a bunch of other questions, right? So one thing that I think you could do with this data, sort of in the service of developing the bigger project, is I would be really interested to see about variation in the resolutions themselves, right? And so I'm just sort of thinking theoretically, I'm interested in, how the sponsors or the writers of these resolutions, what are they trying to do, right? I think that's a question that both this paper but other work sort of needs related to this needs to think about is what exactly are we trying to achieve when we draft a resolution? And you mentioned in the paper this idea of, who is blamed for a conflict. My guess is that has to do a lot with it, right? So, I think it'd be interesting to look through and think about what are conflicts where, if you looked at the way that these are coded in Cal or something like that, where they're sort of observably similar, right? In the sense that, what are all the observables? Is the attacker and the defender, are they both democracies? Like all these things. And then given those similar cases, why do we get resolutions that look one way in some of these cases and others within sort of comparable on ground truth conflicts, right? I can imagine a bunch of different ways that would vary, but sort of one thing that I would be curious about is there a set of states in the UN General Assembly that are disproportionately likely to be targeted by these resolutions? And what I mean by targeted is, imagine that I'm the drafter of this resolution. I think that there's probably some states that are going to vote in favor of condemning this action no matter what. There are some that are going to vote against it, right? Who are the pivotal states whose vote, whether it's a yes, a no, or an abstention, whose vote depends on the way that this resolution is written? I think that's a question that this data collection effort raised for me that I don't think the literature has an answer to. And I think that's a really interesting question. Because, I think you're right that these alignments are pretty different. And I think this is a smart way of attacking the problem, which is these alignments are different from sending troops or sanctions or something, because they're pretty low cost. But at the same time, as you sort of talk about in the paper, there is some cost to taking a stance, right? So for a given conflict, and this is where like proper nouns would be nice. Like I think one way to sort of talk about the paper in the beginning is to, you could give some examples of these cases where, it was, hypothetically, it's publicly known that this country is very upset about this attack, right? And in spite of that, they abstained or they voted no for the resolution, right? To me, that seems like that seems consistent with maybe the resolution was written in a way to try to induce that kind of voting by them, right? So that's all a long-winded way of saying I think there's probably a lot of variation in the text of these resolutions that you could use to think about related questions. I have two more things, and then I'll turn it over to Anton. So another consideration is that the votes, so the text of the resolutions is presumably manipulated. The votes also, I kind of worry is too strong, but a consideration that I would sort of take seriously is the idea that there's probably a coordination aspect to this, right? Where if if I expect that the US is going to vote a certain way, that is going to maybe induce me to vote with them to get things, right? And so, I mean, there's a theoretical point which I personally care more about and find more interesting, which is, the game that's being played here is sort of this thing where we all have, we're coordinating on certain coalitions of votes. But then statistically, it's like if you kind of buy that, that means that these are all not independent of each other, and that's a super annoying comment that anybody who's studying this stuff has encountered many times, but just something to be aware of is probably worth mentioning. And then the last thing, which is just aligned with something that Andrew said, which is I had a little bit of a hard time getting my head around treating this as an ordered outcome. And it seems like the model of this might be that it's just categorical. Thinking, because it wasn't clear to me that they had that ordering, right? That I should actually think about, in sort of like the underlying, like you think of that this is like a random utility model, right? That a yes would always sort of be higher than a no for every country. And so I think, that might be something worth considering. But I really enjoyed reading the paper. Thanks.
All right, thank you, and thank you, Artem, for the chance to discuss this paper. My apologies in advance. My neighbor's dog is occasionally barking, so hopefully that doesn't get too picked up on the audio. So at a high level, I think like most of my comments are going to deal with the empirical analysis, since that's what I wanted to focus on, and I think like the division of labor is among the discussants is appropriate. So at a high level, I think the empirical analysis would benefit a lot from defining a clear estimand that corresponds to each of the particular hypotheses of interest, and maybe move a little bit more away from the sort of like robustness approach of, well, we run a lot of different models and here are the results under them. The usefulness of a particular approach, like whether it's valid or not, really hinges on the underlying identifying assumptions. And you already kind of bring that up. I think this came up in the presentation, where you showed one model that you think may be more credible than just a pooled regression. Well, if that's true, then why do we prefer the pooled regression? So I think that the identifying assumptions that correspond to each of the hypotheses of interest, I think, really need to be stated up front. And arguably, they're going to vary a lot depending on which particular intervention is being studied. So, like, if you want to evaluate one versus the other, I think you kind of can't do that in a single regression model. So, I think the discipline is sort of changing on this, but I'd move away from, I mean, I think it's still fine to think of them as hypotheses, but having a clear connection between the hypothesis and the target estimand, I think, resolves a lot of tensions in the paper. And the best paper to read on this is just like a pitch for the framework, and also, like, I think just like pedagogically very, very good, is the paper by Lundberg, Johnson, and Stewart. I think back in 2017, maybe a little bit later, maybe 2021, titled "What's Your Estimand?" And they sort of make a very, very simple, straightforward point. But I think having a well-defined empirical estimand that isn't just like a coefficient in a model would benefit you a lot, because at the moment it's sort of unclear whether, I think, like the theory implies that you want something more than just simple description. Like you're not wholly agnostic to like, okay, maybe these correlations are just due to some unobserved confounding. We're just interested in description. I think like in most cases, even though we're not in the like physics framework of the hypothesis is some empirical phenomenon either does or does not exist. I think, the social sciences were always thinking in terms of like hypothetical interventions. So like had these countries been different in some way, would they have voted differently with respect to the resolution? And I think that requires thinking a little bit more about what is the intervention that we want to evaluate and what's moving. Because, if we're and it's I think that one of the challenges with the thinking about like the a lot of the key variables, like a lot of the key regressors that you have are defined dyadically. That is like the aggressor's component contributes to it, and also the country's component contributes to it. So, to some extent, is this a purely within analysis? Well, if you think about the intervention as well, what if the attacker were different? Then the identification is entirely cross resolution. And I think that like being a little clear on what's moving, I think helps you specify here is the variation that is actually tied to causal identification. In general, I would advise for the approach of one causal variable, one regression. So having multiple hypotheses and trying to evaluate them in a single model, especially when these are hypotheses about counterfactual interventions, just does not work. The term that gets used in epidemiology is called the table 2 fallacy. There's a nice paper that uses that term. A more recent paper, if you're interested, is this paper by Huntermund and Lau, Louw, titled "On the Nuisance of Control Variables in Causal Regression Analysis." Basically makes the same points, a little bit more recently, targeted at social scientists. We can't interpret every regression from a coefficient from a model as causal, because inherently we're going to be controlling for variables that are like, if we think that a variable is a confounder for one, then it's post-treatment to the other. Like if you're like you can't get both effects out of the model unless you assume they're like entirely unconfounded. And the part of the point of including stuff in the model is we think these are confounders. I think controlling for ideal point distance in particular is very concerning, since it absorbs a lot of the mechanisms implied by the other independent variables. So in some sense, it's not to me, it's not surprising that you would find like, oh, this is the variable that matters a lot and nothing else really does, because insofar as the other mechanisms contribute to where a state is in the broader international alignment of like post World War II ideology that ideal point captures, you're sort of absorbing a lot of that causal mechanism. So it's not clear that corresponds necessarily to the underlying hypothesis you want to test. Again, this goes back to the point about estimands. In general, I would caution against any regression that includes voting behavior as an outcome and ideal point distance as a predictor, because essentially you have the same thing on both sides. And it becomes a little bit tautological in the way that the regression results appear. Because the ideal points are estimated from the voting data. Now, obviously, like they're estimated with more inputs, more information than just these than just the votes that you're looking at. But I would suspect, I didn't get a chance to go and do this, but I would suspect if you go through the discrimination parameters for each of the votes in your data set from our ideal point distance measures, they would be quite high. In other words, like especially for like big international conflicts that are like load onto that kind of single dimension that we pick up, I suspect that these votes tend to sort along that, and so you end up with this like the outcome is on both sides of the regression equation. And so and also like lagging doesn't unfortunately solve the issue, because the model is estimated on the entire time series, and there's sort of there's like the intertemporal feedback is sort of governed by the way that we set that smoothing parameter of the ideal points over time. So it is I don't think that simultaneity bias is like the only concern here, but it's also like kind of standard practices in time series regressions of like lagging. Unfortunately, like doesn't work in the ideal point case, because the model is actually like time agnostic. Like you can run it backwards; it's the same thing. It would only be the case where it's like purely separate if we had no time series smoothing, and then you just get super noisy estimates. And so kind of coming back to the earlier point about defining the estimand, like I don't think it makes sense to do this as a combined regression model. The random effect setup that you have right now also introduces some strong modeling assumptions about like the resolution specific effects. So insofar as you want to identify cross resolution effects, that is like characteristics of the aggressors in a model where you are then also including resolution specific intercepts, like you basically the identification that hinges almost entirely on the modeling assumptions, because how much is in the resolution specific effects versus how much it corresponds to the covariate. And so these sort of like pooled random effects approaches I don't think work well for the kinds of like more model agnostic identification that we want to do these days. I think like like a very worrisome example of this is a recent HAPS or APSR, I forget off the top of my head, but there's a big replication of paper that kind of uses a similar approach where they have basically a random effects model looking at far right European parties, and turns out like the results hinge entirely on one coding. I think that's sort of amplified by the way in which the model structure is set up. So I think moving beyond like I'm fitting a single model and then interpreting it. I think you want a single estimand, and then you recover it by a particular modeling approach. And maybe a lot of the other coefficients are just nuisances, that they're just parameters that we don't really care about. And there you can apply a lot of the more kind of modern ML tech that is essentially recognizes that a lot of the coefficients that we're estimating to get rid of confounding, we don't actually want to interpret them. We just do that to target the thing that we care about. And lastly, like I think the biggest challenge is again this point about like what is an intervention on an ideal point? Like I don't think that makes sense. Because what is actually moving that drives that change? Really, the ideal point is really an outcome. It doesn't make sense to intervene on it net of like I just can't counterfactually imagine that intervention. So it seems like most of what you want is what are the characteristics of the aggressors, and do they change how countries respond? The downside is like if we're thinking about interventions on the aggressors, you are really stretching the sample. Like I do applaud the like move beyond cow. Like I think we want to find data that goes beyond that. But like we don't have 53,000 observations. We have only like 193 UN members at most, 390 resolutions. But I would suspect that a lot of those resolutions are on the same conflict. In fact, one of the things we find in the idea points paper, what we leverage is like, well, they're voting on the same resolution every year. So you mentioned like there are only 15 aggressors, which it really does sort of still, where unfortunately I think in cross national regressions we're always in kind of small sample world, and so you also run into like overlap problems here on covariates like time. So yeah, so kind of coming back to the original point, I think tying your hypotheses to clearly defined estimands will resolve a lot of that, will like lead you down the correct set of choices for what is the appropriate analysis strategy, like what do I control for kind of stuff.
Great. Thanks to all three discussants for some really interesting and useful feedback on that. We'll turn it back over to Artem now for 5 or 7-ish minutes. If you want to sort of respond to those, give any thoughts that you have, we can have this section be more sort of discussion based. So for the discussants, if you want to respond back in sort of live conversation model, we can sort of do that as well as we wrap things up and give some final thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much for the helpful comments here. So I will go sequentially over what I've heard here. So the first thing that I wanted to comment on is, well, the assumption that the DV is ordinal, or, well, I am using linear models for the main set of analysis, so it is linear in those analysis. So I think my main consideration here was kind of the computational tractability of whatever I'm doing here. So I really wanted to be able to run those within roll call analysis, because I think they are relatively clean compared to cross-resolution comparisons, as others have already mentioned. And I was, well, really thinking hard of how can I define correct assumptions regarding the nature of this dependent variable while still, well, making this analysis tractable. So if there are any ideas on that, I will really appreciate that. As you might have noticed, I have a multinomial logit model. It is in the appendix, and it is also discussed a little bit in the actual paper. But in that model, again, I do not have fixed effects because I don't want to ruin that model in the first place, right? When the next point here that I have is does every conflict get its own resolution? I think this is a point that Andrew made earlier, right? So, well, no, because most conflicts are primarily voted on by the United Nations Security Council, and based on how the United Nations as an organization is set up, the idea is that every conflict should first be voted on in the context of the Security Council, and then if there are any issues there, it will be voted on by the General Assembly. So we can see that many conflicts do not get their own General Assembly resolution, even though they already have a Security Council resolution. And this is one of the reasons why I am pretty certain here that this sample, this is not even close to the population of those conflicts that are considered in the UN context, right? So this is why I'm trying to really focus on these differences that happen within the same roll call. This is why I'm really cognizant of this fact that like cross resolution differences are, well, a little less informative because not every conflict gets voted on in the first place. So another comment here is how many resolutions on democratic aggressors pertain to Israel? Well, yeah, this is something that I also considered in the additional subsample analysis that are presented closer to the end of the results section. So even if we remove Israel as the aggressor, those results do not change that much, even when we are focusing on like this difference between democratic aggressors and non-democratic aggressors. So, yeah, big swings in the data resolutions themselves are driven by something else. So, Brad's comment earlier, I definitely agree with that. And this also goes back partially to what Anton was saying. So, yeah, kind of, I understand that the wording of these resolutions is very, very different. But honestly, like, I didn't really want to delve into, like text analysis with every resolution because I don't know whether I can I don't know whether I can make this analysis credible, in the sense of like trying to quantify whether each resolution has like stronger language or weaker language. I think I might be able to do that, but I'm not exactly sure whether this would, contribute to this paper enough to warrant like the time effort that this would entail. So again, this is why I am trying to focus on differences within the same roll call. I understand that, yeah, like I do not have the full sample here. I understand that every resolution is different. So let's just hold constant the level of condemnation, the severity of this language in the resolution. Let's just hold it constant and see what happens. So this is part of the idea here. Yeah, so is there a set of states more likely to be targeted? Yeah, this is really interesting. Whose vote depends on the way these resolutions are drafted. Again, the same answer is that I would really want to understand how these resolutions are drafted, but right now I don't have a very good idea of how I would approach that empirically. And well, yeah, just one small comment that I have on like using the ideal distance and the regressions together with votes as the DV. Part of the answer here would be that like the identification of aggressors is not in the original Bailey, Strezhnev, and Wooten data, right? So like I do this identification myself, so I kind of think that this partially like reduces the problem here because this is kind of adding new stuff. But yeah, I was also thinking about that. I was thinking about that endogeneity, but like the problem here is that I want to know whether these votes are determined by interests. And I don't know whether we have a better measure of interests that would be applicable to like 193 states. So I would really be happy to run those regressions like with a different measure of interest. So if you have any ideas here, it would be really greatly appreciated. And I think that these are all comments that I have at this point, but I've also noted all the other comments and suggestions here, so I will definitely consider them in future revisions. Thank you.
I'm happy to jump in on that last point. So I think like the concern would be that like yes, you're able to identify like the aggressors, which I believe would imply that like well you know if they voted no or yes on the resolution. So you know the aggressor is probably not voting for their own condemnation. And so insofar as the yes votes are contrary to the no votes, like the way that that gets picked up in the ideal point model is that that would locate those actors further away from each other. So, unfortunately, I'm not so sure that that addresses that point. But I think the more fundamental one is like I don't quite know what an inner like I don't think interest is a causal variable in like any coherent sense. Like, what does it mean to modify interests net of modifying other factors? Like anytime you think of like, well, what if interests change? Well, you know, in the kind of classic, you know, coming from a more political economy background, like, well, we think interests come from some material component. So the actual intervention is on that material thing. And then what we observe here is like we're like interest is just the way that we call this like dimension reduction technique that we apply to the votes. In some sense, interests are the outcome. The interesting causal variables are the other stuff. And then kind of looking through the rest of the hypotheses, I think a lot of the hypotheses that you have here are really about like counterfactual aggressors. Like, what if this aggressor were not democratic? Then how would that change? Which I think, unfortunately, like that intervention defined as such is inherently a cross-resolution strategy as opposed to within. So like I think the choice of within or cross-resolution isn't necessarily like, oh, I want to take advantage of this variation or not. It's does the intervention that you're conceptualizing lend itself to that approach versus like is it possible to conceive of the intervention like within a resolution? Like what if one of these voters actually like you know wasn't democratic? So, I mean like maybe that like that's kind of worth considering. But I think like the way that you kind of have it set up right now is this like um the intervention like the treatment variable it consists of two components combined together like the aggressor characteristics and the voter characteristics and it's sort of like you start like when like you see this a lot in the social science especially these days and I actually think one other paper this is a bit out of the way slightly different framework for approaching it but it may help conceptualize like well, what do I have to assume is random type statements is like the modern approach to shift chair designs in the social sciences. I'm thinking of like the Borosiak and Hall 2023 Econometrica paper. There they make the argument that like, well, if you have a treatment that is constituted by this sort of combination of two things, for identification, you have to assume that one or the other thing is random. Either the something about the like the aggressor is random and the characteristics of the voters is fixed, or you know the aggressors are fixed and like there's random democracy within or a conditionally ignorable democracy within resolution. So that may be another useful way to think about that. But yeah, I think unfortunately the like the no the aggressor is voting no. I would assume if the aggressor votes to condemn themselves that would seem interesting, and so that's still being picked up by the ideal point distances.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and start wrapping stuff up there. So thanks to Artem for presenting a really great paper. I enjoyed this discussion a lot, and thank you also to the three discussants for your time and for considering this paper. For others, you can go back and watch the video from the beginning on the YouTube page where it'll be posted if you missed any part of the presentations at the outset or for interested folks who weren't here. So if there's any comments or questions, you can feel free to comment on the YouTube page itself, or you can also email Artem to chat more about the paper in the future. So thank you all again for your time.